trying to figure out exactly why Jared Kushner met in December with a Russian banker with links to Vladimir Putin.
Russia has been genius at manipulating people.
Questions about the relationships with Russia are greater than ever.
That have nothing to do with Russia.
The White House blaming Kushner's secret back channel request on the Kremlin.
The naivete here to believe in this environment you're going to have a back channel, that is not secret. It's going to go public.
I think his clearance should be under review as we speak.
I don't like it. I just don't.
We must act with honesty and with integrity. You're only as good as your word.
Angela Merkel bluntly saying the U.S. is no longer a reliable partner.
I think that the Europeans are legitimately concerned.
This is New Day with Chris Cuomo and Allison Camerata.
All right, we want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world. This is New Day. It's Tuesday, May 30th, 6 o'clock here in New York. And we have exclusive new reporting on the Russia investigation. We're going to give you that in a moment. There are several big stories on the starting line. Congressional and federal investigators reportedly scrutinizing Jared Kushner's meeting with a Russian banker who has obvious links to Vladimir Putin.
President Trump continues the search for a new FBI director to replace James Comey, one of the many pressing issues that he faces this week. And German Chancellor Angela Merkel doubling down on her doubts about the U.S. being a reliable partner for European nations. So there's a lot to cover. And we begin with our exclusive new reporting on the investigation into Russia's meddling in the 2016 election. Jim Sciutto, Pamela Brown, and Dana Bash broke the story. And Jim Sciutto joins us now. Give us the latest, Jim.
Good morning, Allison and Chris. Two former intelligence officials and a congressional source tell my colleagues Pamela, Dana, and I that Russian government officials discuss having potentially derogatory information about then presidential candidate Donald Trump and some of his top aides. This in conversations intercepted by U.S. intelligence during the 2016 election. One source described the information as financial in nature and said the discussion centered around whether the Russians had leverage with Trump's inner circle. The source says the intercepted communication suggested to U.S. intelligence that Russians believe they had the ability to influence the administration through the derogatory information. Now, I should add the sources privy to the descriptions of the communications written by U.S. intelligence cautioned that the Russian claims to each other could have been exaggerated or even made up. The details of the communication shed new light on information U.S. intelligence received about Russian claims of influence. The contents of the conversations made clear to U.S. officials that Russia was considering ways to influence the election, even if their claims turned out to be false. As CNN first reported, the U.S. intercepted discussions of Russian officials bragging about cultivating relationship with Trump campaign aides, including Trump's first national security advisor, Michael Flynn, to influence Trump himself. Following CNN's report, the New York Times said that Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, was also discussed.
All right, Jim, so very tantalizing headline. Do we know anything about who the Russians were talking about specifically in terms of who were around Trump they might be able to influence or who they were working?
That's right. Well, beyond Trump himself, none of the sources would say which specific Trump aides were discussed. One of the officials said the intelligence report masked the American names, but it was clear the conversations revolved around the Trump campaign team. Another source would not give more specifics, citing the classified nature of the information involved. This is yet another round of false and unverified claims. I should say we reached out to the White House for comment, and just overnight got this answer. Quote, this is yet another round of false and unverified claims made by anonymous sources to smear the president. The reality is a review of the president's income from the last 10 years showed that he had virtually no financial ties at all. There appears to be no limit to which the president's political opponents will go to perpetuate this false narrative, including illegally leaking classified material. All this, of course, does play into the hands of our adversaries, they say, and put the country at risk, end quote. We also reached out to the FBI and the Office of Director of National Intelligence. They did not have a comment. I should note that the president himself, as you're aware, has insisted on multiple occasions that he has no financial dealings with Russia.
So, Jim, is this new reporting that you have part of the current investigation?
Well, the FBI investigation into Russian meddling in the U.S. election, which, of course, was recently taken over by special counsel Robert Mueller, includes seeking answers as to whether there was any coordination with associates of Trump and examining alleged financial dealings of key Trump associates. The FBI would not comment on whether any of the claims discussed in the intercepts we've just reported have been verified. By the time Trump took office, questions about some of his aides' financial dealings with Russian entities were already under investigation. And soon after the Republican convention, Paul Manafort had already stepped aside because of questions about off-the-book payments he received consulting a pro-Putin candidate in Ukraine. This is what officials told CNN last summer. Manafort has denied he received any illicit finances. He's also denied any wrongdoing in connection with his work for Trump and foreign officials. He has offered to testify before congressional committees investigating Russia's election interference. Also, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn is being investigated for failing to disclose payments he received from Russian entities for a trip he took to Moscow in December 2015. On that trip, you'll remember, Flynn appeared alongside President Putin at a gala in honor of the Russian state media outlet Russia Today. Flynn now faces multiple investigations for failing to disclose on his security clearance forms payments he received for that Moscow trip from Russian entities. This, in addition to questions about lobbying that he did for Turkey. Allison and Chris, there's a lot there. I'd say the key headline is these intercepts were Russians, at least Russia-to-Russia communications, claiming that they had derogatory information on both the president and the president's aides.
Jim Sciutto, appreciate it, boy. That is a big headline. Thank you for bringing it to us. Now, look, President Trump is clearly not a fan of any of this when we're talking about the investigation into Russian meddling, and he has struggled to find ways to tamp it down. Well, now investigators are reportedly focusing on a meeting in December between Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and this Russian banker named Gorkov. So, CNN's Joe Johns is live at the White House with more on that. Joe.
Chris, that's absolutely right. The White House continues to wrestle with how to explain many contacts, including contacts by the president's senior advisor, Jared Kushner, with, as we have said before, the Russian ambassador to the United States, Sergei Kislyak, as well as, reported by the New York Times this morning, new interest in a meeting and conversations between Jared Kushner and Sergei Gorkov, a Russian banker who works for a bank that essentially is under sanction by the United States. Not clear exactly what those conversations were about. Persistent reports, of course, that there was an attempt to set up a back channel with Russia. The administration, on and off the record, has somewhat downplayed, not talked much about it, as well has not confirmed or denied, but simply said even if it happened, it's not a big deal. Jared Kushner, for his part, as well as his wife, Ivanka Trump, have been keeping a low profile throughout all of this in order to perhaps see if it just blows over. Jared Kushner has sent the message that he would like to sit down and explain, at least he said that through his attorneys. One possible explanation, as reported by CNN's Gloria Borger, is that it was the Russians who tried to set up the back channel and not Kushner. Back to you.
All right, Joe, appreciate it. Let's discuss what matters here and why with these new headlines surrounding the Russian investigation. Let's bring back Jim Sciutto, and let's bring in CNN political analyst David Gregory and CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger. David Gregory. Now, when we're talking about these latest allegations about Kushner, part of this is timing, right? When he was taking meetings on behalf of Trump or behalf of himself. And then you have that second consideration of what kind of meetings and with whom. What do you think the main points are to focus on?
I think there's a couple of things. There is a darker route that I'm sure investigators are following, which is wondering whether the Russians had something on Trump or his associates that was negative that they felt could be used to compromise the incoming administration. And do you have then an administration with key figures trying to figure out what that is, trying to mitigate that, to negotiate over it, something like that? I think it could simply be naivete, arrogance, bad judgment, an incoming administration and key figures around the president thinking, we can figure out this relationship with the Russians. We'll do it our way. We know better than these Obama folks and these intelligence folks, and we'll just have at it. And so you have somebody in Kushner who's got no foreign policy experience, who's not the appointed person to handle this kind of portfolio, going about it, and again, in a naive way and an arrogant way. And in all of this, I think wherever the investigation takes us, it's hard to escape the idea that there wasn't bad judgment being used here, because you have a foreign power that we knew at the time had engaged in trying to manipulate the election, trying to tilt the election toward Trump. We know that this is a foreign power that had manipulated or tried to tried to manipulate two previous administrations in their own diplomatic dealings, right? And so, at the very least, it seems so naive and reckless to think that that you're not going to be used by the Russians here. So I think that's kind of the broad overview, and I think this is where the special counsel and the investigation have to be plunging ahead.
David Sanger, what do you see here?
Well, Allison, it all sits on what the content of the conversation was. There's nothing illegal about back channels, although I agree with David completely that it's very fraught if you're doing back channels when you are in a transition. There have been back channels done before. Nixon engaged in some, Kennedy engaged in some during transition times, but they're really a lot easier to go do once you're in office. So why would he meet the banker? Well, if the explanation that the White House would prefer, that this was set up by the Russians, he's setting up a way for Putin ultimately to be able to talk, maybe that will turn out to be bad judgment but not illegal. The difficulty is that the bank that the banker represents would have had a huge amount to benefit from the lifting of the U.S. sanctions and international sanctions against Russia because of the Ukraine military activity and, of course, seizing Crimea. There was talk early in the Trump transition and talk by Mr. Trump during the campaign in interviews about moving ahead to lift those sanctions. If that was being done while there was a government in place, the Obama government, that would be pretty problematic. So that's the sort of fine line that I think the investigators are going to be focusing on.
And then you have the X factor, which is if they could show that Kushner was meeting with this banker for his own personal financing purposes, then he'd have a very big issue. Jim Sciutto, we keep hearing from the White House and Trump defenders, this is about style, not substance. This was not about, Kushner looking for money or trying to work the Russians in a wrong way. This is just about their experience level and not about anything worse. John McCain disagrees when it comes to just simple style points. Listen to what he said.
My view of it is I don't like it. I just don't. I know that some administration officials are saying, well, that's standard procedure. I don't think it's standard procedure prior to the inauguration of a president of the United States by someone who is not in an appointed position.
Now, we keep hearing this, Jim, the one president at a time thing. You can dismiss that as a formality, but that's not how officials are taking it. What do you hear?
Listen, style matters, right? Because beyond the issue of what the law is, whether laws were broken or not, there are norms. Well, one being there's one president at a time, and that's not just a fashion, right? I mean, that's something that's important in part because here you have an impression or at least a question because the outgoing president, who was still president of the United States at the time, had a different approach to Russia than the incoming president. Was there, it's a question, we don't know the answer, but it's a reasonable question, was there an effort by the Trump administration to undermine the policy of the Obama administration, specifically on sanctions against Russia? That's a fair question to ask whether any law was broken or not. And then you get to the issue with both Davids, which both Davids mentioned, which is, was there a naivete here, right? Was there an opening to exploitation by Russia? I asked Michael Hayden about this yesterday, and he said it doesn't have to be nefarious to be a problem. Because here you have a private citizen without experience. Russia's very adept at this kind of stuff. Were they looking for some sort of advantage there? And then the final thing I would just say is, if it is true that Jared Kushner was looking to have these conversations in some sort of Russian secure facility outside of the ears of U.S. intelligence, what does that say of the incoming president's view of American intelligence services? And why would you want to have that kind of conversation in private? It raises a lot of legitimate questions.
Can I raise this point? So I think it's important to think about a broader context as well. A few minutes ago, I said that you had two administrations that have been manipulated by Russia. I want to be clear in what I mean by that. They proved to be untrustworthy, right? Putin, after 9/11, signaled cooperation with the Bush administration. That proved to be an untrustworthy channel diplomatically in terms of invading former Soviet republics and whatnot toward the end of the Bush administration. There was an attempted reset under the Obama administration. They proved to be untrustworthy diplomatic in terms of interlocutors on that path forward. What I think that the Trump people could be accused of at this point, which is not about illegality, which is being investigated, is why is it they thought they were immune from being manipulated diplomatically or worse by the Russians, a foreign power that had just sought to manipulate and tamper with our election, and it proved completely untrustworthy as diplomatic partners to 2 prior administrations. So that hubris with which they approached and said, let's just barrel forward with representatives of the Putin administration and bankers and all the rest, we can make this work. When you had a guy in Michael Flynn, the national security advisor, who had already been compromised. That, to me, is what's suspicious.
Okay. David Sanger, hold that thought. We're going to take a quick break and come back to you in a moment. Panel, stick around.
All right, we'll get some great context for these issues because in the next hour, we're going to talk about these threads and questions with the man on your screen, the former director of national intelligence, James Clapper.
Meanwhile, German Chancellor Angela Merkel is doubling down on her doubts about President Trump, insisting that Europe can no longer count on the U.S. How badly fractured is this critical relationship?
Donald Trump was elected in part to shake things up at home and abroad, and now there is pushback from a key ally. German Chancellor Angela Merkel signals a deepening rift with the United States, insisting Europe can't completely rely on the USA. CNN senior international correspondent Frederick Pleitgen live in London with more heavy words.
Very heavy words, Chris, and a lot of frustration they're building up in Berlin. And it was a lot of things that President Trump said while he was in Europe last week that really rubbed Angela Merkel the wrong way, it seems. Some of the things he said about trade with Germany, where he said the Germans were bad for exporting so many cars to America, but also the lack of what the Germans feel is a security commitment to European allies was really something that I think really hurt a lot of people in Germany. It prompted Angela Merkel to say the following thing. We know that transatlantic relations are of immense importance for us all. They rest on mutual values and interests, particularly when we are in times, as we are, of intense challenges. And here comes the important part. The last few days have shown me that the times when we could completely rely on others are over. Obviously, referring to this current White House, it was interesting because she qualified those remarks. She said, we still believe in transatlantic relations. We're just not sure what we're getting from this White House. And you know, Angela Merkel, Chris, right now is in an election campaign. However, her political rivals who are running against her are actually supporting her in what she said, Chris.
All right. Thank you very much, Fred, for all of that. Let's bring back our panel. We have David Gregory and David Sanger. Also joining us is Sarah Westwood. She's a White House correspondent for the Washington Examiner. Great to see all of you. David Sanger, so you heard Angela Merkel there. She said the time that we could rely on the West or completely rely on others is over. Germany's foreign minister put an even finer point on it. Let me read to you what he said. The short-sighted policies of the American government stand against the interests of the European Union. The West has become smaller. At least it has become weaker. What's the significance of all of this?
Well, Alison, these are remarkable comments from our closest allies. I mean, think about this trip that the president took where he arrives in Saudi Arabia. He's treated like a visiting king. The relationship's incredibly warm. He then gets to Europe with our more traditional allies, and it's a series of alienating comments on both sides and some alienating actions. So why is that important? A few things. First, the United States, since the end of World War II, has always been the leader of the Atlantic Alliance. And that means that we've not only been the biggest contributor to NATO, which is one of President Trump's complaints, and presidents before him have said more should be contributed by others, but it also means that those countries have relied on the United States, its nuclear umbrella, its moral compass, its ability to lead. And what you were hearing from Chancellor Merkel was those days are over. We may need to seek our own way. At another point yesterday, she said, basically, we can't trust the British that much after Brexit, and we can't trust the Americans. And those were the two of the major victors of World War II with whom Germany had come into this alliance after the war was over. And if we look back at this moment as a temporary blip, that'll be one thing. If we look back at it as a major breach in a relationship that stretches back 70 years, that'll be another.
Sarah, how much of this is about President Trump pushing on real issues that make Merkel uncomfortable, that the EU is being criticized, that the other major allies haven't put in their 2% to defense-oriented work the way NATO lays out, specifically Germany?
That's certainly part of it. I mean, Trump's push to have NATO member states meet their 2% of their GDP commitments to defense spending, that's aimed largely at countries like Germany that have failed to meet those commitments. And it seems like the immediate catalyst for Chancellor Merkel's comments was President Trump's refusal to endorse the Paris Climate Accords at the G7 meeting. If there was a time and a place for President Trump to reaffirm America's commitment to that deal, the G7 would have been the setting for that. It didn't happen, and I think that ruffled some feathers, particularly among European leaders like Merkel, who view the Paris climate deal as a bellwether issue for American leadership. But these tensions have clearly been simmering for some time now. President Trump represents this populist wave in America that has also affected support for the EU in Europe. And obviously, he's cheered openly Eurosceptics like Nigel Farage, while Chancellor Merkel is someone who is the face of the EU in a lot of ways and preserving it through this populist wave. She's in an election year in a country where President Trump is deeply unpopular. So it's almost surprising that we haven't heard this kind of rhetoric from her earlier, that she's waited till now to voice doubts about the Trump administration, given the amount of uncertainty the president has created.
And particularly since, David, we've heard criticism, President Trump criticized Angela Merkel before this. I mean, it did seem as though there was some bad blood, but now it has morphed from whatever personality conflict they had into a geopolitical conflict.
Well, something more fundamental. I mean, I think we have to separate breaches on policy, areas where you're going to have disagreement. We saw that as we've been discussing over the past couple of days, over the Iraq War and how it broke America with Western Europe for a period of time, but never fundamentally. Right now you have differences over trade, over migration policy and the broader fight over terrorism and about climate. But I want to underline what David said. The reason why the United States led the Atlantic Alliance after World War II is that there had been 2 world wars on the continent that killed tens of millions of people on the continent alone, let alone American losses as well. So this was an effort to have America lead so Europe wouldn't continue to kill itself and to act as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. That's just as true today. We may have disagreements on issues between the United States and the European Union. We're major trading partners, and there is a fundamental alliance that is critically important against a resurgent Russia. Here you had the specter of Germany saying we got to go it alone. I mean, that hasn't happened since before World War I, which turned out to be so disastrous. So that's what I think is important about this moment that we don't want to lose sight of. These people are more than our friends. They are family in the global order that America leads.
The question is this an opportunity where President Trump mollifies, or does he double down? We'll have to see.
Panel, thank you very much.
All right, up next, lawmakers, nearly former Panamanian dictator and convicted drug trafficker Manuel Noriega has died. The 83-year-old recently underwent an operation after suffering a hemorrhage following brain surgery in March. In the 1980s, you'll remember, Noriega went from a big U.S. ally to wanted man, culminating in a 1989 U.S. invasion, flushing him out of Panama. Noriega spent almost 20 years in U.S. prisons before being extradited to France and ultimately back to Panama.
ISIS is claiming responsibility for 2 deadly
chaos, and that's going to be disputed among partisans. But he called ICE agents to turn in protesters who were holding signs that read, "I am illegal," spark a simmering tension there. You know, you have a lot of Latinos in that room.
Yeah.
They took it as a personal slight. And this is what we're about right now.
Absolutely. You can see how overblown everything gets with all of the heated rhetoric, and then something sparks it. We will follow that. Meanwhile, is the Russia cloud eroding support among President Trump's die-hard supporters? Show of hands, how many people are concerned about the Russia investigation? Okay, we'll tell you more of what they said and how they are feeling 4 months into this administration. It seems every day brings a new development in the investigation into Russia's meddling in the U.S. election. But how do President Trump's most ardent supporters feel about this? Well, we assembled a group from Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and Florida to ask them about it in part 2 of our voter panel. About how he likes that he feels that Christians have more of a voice now. Right. He feels that he had to sort of be silenced in the past. So he likes what President Trump stands for. But what you heard from all of them is that it's too early, really, for them to give him a final grade, you know, that they're willing to give him a longer chance.
He does have the blessing among his base of people really believing the president wants to do the right thing and giving him the benefit of every doubt. Though every time I see one of these panels now, I want you to sit with the people who aren't for Trump. Because they're the bigger,
who are not for Trump?
Yeah, they're the bigger part of the country. They're really upset right now.
Well,
they're trying to organize themselves. I know, but you know, the Trump people say, well, that's the media.
I know that.
But you have a base that's equally upset with the media about how they're covering Trump, but for the exact opposite reasons of the Trump folks.
Well, it's hard to please everybody, but I do think that we do hear a lot of voices who point out the things that they think that President Trump gets wrong every day. But I think that it's really helpful and instructive to check back in with people who still support him wholeheartedly and who were diehard supporters, just to see how they feel. And you heard one last thing. You heard Judy there say, the influx of media, the deluge of media every day is hard for us to sort through. And I think a lot of people feel that.
Especially if you see information and criticism as opposition, which is how the Trump base sees it. So that's tough for them to process.
Coming up in just minutes, we will talk about the Russia investigation with former Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper. Stick around for that.
This is a man who does not struggle with having a lot of information coming at him at once. So Tiger Woods, new trouble for him on the personal front. He was arrested on suspicion of DUI. I'll tell you why this is an interesting story. Tiger's explanation of what landed him in jail, it is worth discussing in the Bleacher Report ahead.
Tell us what you see today, Chad.
Allison, certainly that could have been a tornado. I was in Birmingham, Alabama yesterday, and the storms were going up so fast, and they were heading that way. This weather is brought to you by Purina, your pet, our passion. Another day of potential severe weather, but this time it shifts up toward the northeast, into New York, into Pennsylvania, Du Bois and Williamsburg, and all the way up, Williamsport, all the way up even into parts of northeast New York. We will watch the storms as they move into the northeast today. Really across parts of the Turnpike of Pennsylvania and then on up into the Adirondacks and Catskills for most of the day. But as the nighttime comes in, we could even get storms all the way down to Philadelphia, D.C., and yes, even New York City. You could see some storms today. Now, in between the raindrops, temperatures are very nice, 60s and 70s, normal weather.
Tiger Woods is apologizing following his arrest Monday after driving under the influence. Woods was arrested early Memorial Day near his home in Florida. He released this statement saying, quote, "I understand the severity of what I did and I take full responsibility for my actions. I want the public to know that alcohol was not involved. What happened was an unexpected reaction to prescribed medications. I didn't realize the mix of medications had affected me so strongly," unquote. Woods adding he expects more from himself and will do everything in his power to make sure it doesn't happen again. Police in Jupiter, Florida say he was arrested at 3 a.m. Monday. He spent several hours in jail before being released without bail. The 41-year-old Woods has been off the Pro Tour rehabbing from a fourth back surgery, which he had last month.
Oh, boy. That mugshot is, you know, it looks like how the mighty have fallen. I mean, and it's no longer enough, Coy, to say, well, alcohol wasn't involved. It's prescription drugs. I mean, that's a problem that's rampant across the country.
Yeah, if that's true, you know, Tiger says that there was no alcohol involved. If that's true, then it really is a window into a bigger problem. There are so many people who drive on medications and they don't understand the effects. They're seeing it more and more in law enforcement. It'd be interesting if Tiger Woods becomes the face of that.
So true. You think, oh, a doctor prescribed it. It must be safer than alcohol, but there is Exhibit A. Meanwhile, Germany's Angela Merkel doubling down on her doubts that Europe can rely on the U.S. under President Trump. Christiane Amanpour joins us with her take. Next.
All right, so the strong alliance between the U.S. and Europe is showing some signs of strain, at least if you follow the talk. Because for the second day in a row, you have the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, lashing out at President Trump, or really lashing back, saying that the Europeans now have to take their destiny into their own hands, that she doesn't know exactly what she can depend on from the United States. And the President of the United States is responding on Twitter this morning. Here's his case. We have a massive trade deficit with Germany, plus they pay far less than they should on NATO and military. Very bad for U.S. This will change. Here to discuss, CNN's chief international correspondent and host of Amanpour, Christiane Amanpour. How do you see the merits of this ongoing debate?
Well, it's really an unfortunate situation, particularly if this is all going to be waged in the Twitter sphere right now. Angela Merkel gave what many people did feel was quite a bold statement at a campaign rally in a beer hall over the weekend, after having come away from the G7 and the NATO summits with Donald Trump, where there were highly and well-publicized disputes between all the other G7 members and the United States on climate, on trade, on NATO's Article 5, and on those kinds of things. So this was not unexpected to highlight those kinds of things. I think some of the words that Angela Merkel used have been ignored. She said, you know, after these last few days, I feel we can no longer fully rely on the United States, and she added the UK, at least to some extent. There were all these words. She then turned it back towards what she's long wanted to do, to say we must, as Europeans, actually take our destiny more firmly into our own hands. So that's sort of the big picture. But I also spoke to the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Bundestag yesterday, who's a member of her party and an ally, and he basically said, look, we've had 70 years of American leadership, successful leadership, multilateralism,